There's material. There's a gesture towards the object. A movement on the object. A motion with the material. There's a pause, a rotating gaze. Years of observing. Black holes into a minute. Final project, idiosyncratic. If I give it to you or you buy it from me, it doesn't make you a materialist. Materialism is an ugly word. Materials shaped by nimble and inspired hands. Hands that know and never know is beauty. There's movement, there's an object, there's material, there's a gesture.
Okay, so now it's time to start glazing. So we have some of our maybe fry trays and our plates, sort of ready to go. And one of the things that is important to do, if these pieces have been sitting around for a while, and especially some of your pieces actually were sitting on a cart out in the back, and during those fires in Orange County, and the ash was kind of building up on them, so they're all going to need to be wiped really well. So you just need a damp sponge, not a wet sponge, a damp sponge, because you don't want to get it too wet. You just want to kind of make sure you get any kind of layers of dust. If anything's been sitting around for a while, we want to get that. And if it's really, really dirty, you can actually wash it, underneath a sink. But then what happens, and you can kind of see the difference in even the color here. This one I washed underneath the sink. It's still very damp. So it's already sucked up the water, and so because these pieces are still porous, that's why we like to glaze them. We fired them once, so they're sturdy enough to handle, but they're still porous, and so that they'll suck up the glaze as we put it on there and kind of hold it. But if you get it really damp, and you don't let it dry out again, then what will happen is it won't take the glaze very well. So if you do have to wash it or want to wash all your pieces one day, and then let them sit out in the sun for a while and kind of wait a day, the next day, and start actually glazing. So one of the things that we have to do is we can't have any glaze on the bottom of our pieces. The bottom's going to need to be totally clean of glaze, because it's going to sit on a shelf, and what happens is this glaze we put on, which is basically, in a sense, it's kind of like, liquefied powdered glass, and so it's going to hit temperature and fuse to the piece. But if it's on the bottom, it's going to fuse to the shelf. So we need the bottom needs to be clean and a little bit up, quarter inch all the way around. So one thing we can do is, if I sit this down like this, and I take a pencil and I just kind of run it along the bottom, so that pencil point is a bit up, and then I can kind of see, like, is that enough? Maybe right here, I'll kind of draw that in, and I'll just kind of come up to that pencil line, and this pencil will burn out in the firing. So I'm looking at it right now. I should be able to kind of see a little bit of a line here when I set it down and look at it, underneath. After I glaze it, I should be able to see a little line of no glaze all the way around. So it's always good to do that, so you have a little thing where you're kind of brushing the glaze on. And on a piece like this, I'm always going to start on the inside first. I really want to get the inside done first before I even work on the outside necessarily. Makes it easier, because once the inside is done and it's sort of dry, I can lightly sort of hold it like this and then brush my coats on the outside, and then do whatever else I might want to finish it. Piece like this, I can do that same pencil technique, or we can kind of see on the plate, there's a little bit of a rise right there. So I just kind of want to, maybe take a look at that and just kind of run my pencil, sort of along that curve. And so maybe it was something like that. So I know I can brush underneath here and then all on top of here. And then one of the things is you can't come all the way down to the bottom because the glaze as it melts is going to drop a little bit. It's going to move a little bit. And some glazes move more than others. But if we need to have some kind of gap there to give it so that room to move down slightly in the firing. And so hopefully it won't be touching the shelf and we'll be able to get it off the shelf. Because the easiest and fastest way and most efficient way for me to get your piece off the shelf if it glazed on there is to take a hammer and smash it right off. And then I got to grind the shelf down. So it's much better if we don't have it fused to the shelf. So let's avoid that. So one of the things I want to do is I want to kind of pick the glaze I'm going to use. And so on something like this that is, I'll possibly be putting food in there, I want to have a nice smooth sort of, glaze in there. It makes it easier to clean and all this stuff. And so Indigo Float's a good one I like. It's nice blue, but what it'll do is what we call break. So when a glaze breaks, what we mean is that where it hits some of these thin spots, it'll change color. And in this case, it'll go slightly sort of brown. So there's a lot of rutile in here, and it will go slightly sort of brown on the corners and sort of highlight that corner. Now I may also put another glaze on this edge there just to make it look a little bit more interesting. The first thing I'm going to do when we start glazing with this Indigo Float is I'm going to make sure the cap is on very tight, and then I'm going to shake it. So don't ever grab one of these things and start shaking it without checking the cap. And I'm telling you from experience what can happen. And you can imagine what happens if you go like this and that cap comes flying off. Not only will we waste a bunch of glaze, but kind of makes for a bad day. You got glaze all over yourself. So make sure, shake it up, especially if no one's used it for a while. You really want to make sure you sort of shake it up, and then I'll pop it out, pop up this sort of lid, and then take a look, and maybe when it's full like this, it's pretty easy just to come in. But also I might be easier, I'll just pour a little bit out in some kind of small container that I can pour back in whatever's left over. And I will start to put in some layers. Now what you don't want to do is sort of spread it out super thin like that. That's not optimum with glazing. With glazing you want to go sort of short, sort of passes, and like that. And the first coat will go on and dry relatively fast because it will be taken up by the piece, this sort of the porosity of this bisque-fired piece will take that glaze up. And I want to kind of keep sort of a rhythm right now. I'm going upwards on my brush strokes here. And I will change that the second time. And go through. And I can go ahead and do this lip now too. Sometimes it's easy just to kind of tap like that. Give it a pass. Tap a little glaze on there. Give it a pass with the brush. Okay, so while this first coat is drying, I'll work on some other stuff. And like I was saying, the first coat usually dries pretty quickly because the piece is porous and will kind of take up the glaze. And then the second coat there will take sort of longer to dry. So one of the things I might like to do too, if I'm doing a few different things, is have a little piece of paper next to the glaze I'm using and just kind of make a little mark. So do that little line, and that's my first coat. Right, so I know that, kind of keep things sort of in order here, So put this stuff sort of to the side, and then start working on one of the plates. Now with these plates, I'm going to do a little experimentation with some new glazes, and so because of that, it's important I want to write down what I've been doing. So I already got this as number 1. Got my name on it. I already made that mark. So I'm going to take this piece of paper, which you should have gotten some copies in your box of stuff to glaze. And so I'll just kind of write down test plate number 1, put my name here too, of course, Mr. Mead, and period, well, all periods. Okay, so anyway, so the first glaze I'm going to put down is this black. It's a newer one that I've seen from Duncan. I haven't used it before, but I thought I might try it. It's a satin, so some of the glazes we have here, like lapis satin and stuff like that are considered to be satin. What that means is it's got a little bit of gloss, but it's not going to be super glossy, right? So same thing when we talk about house paints and stuff like that, whether something is a matte or flat glaze or satin glaze or semi-gloss or high gloss and stuff like that. So same thing kind of with these glazes. So they're the satin, so it should be sort of a low sheen, sort of black. So put some in this to sort of try it, and I want to make sure I write that down. And I like to write down the brand. So it's a Duncan, and it is in black satin. It's S-A-T-I-N, satin, not Satan, like sometimes kids like to use that. They want to know about the white, the Satan white. It's actually satin white that we have here in the classroom. So write that down, and I like to usually sketch maybe my picture, so I might do some things. So in this square I'm going to do 4 coats of the black, and then on these edges I will end up doing 2 coats of the black, and then I'm going to try a couple other glazes in between. So I'll go on top of that black with this texturizer stuff, and then this other glaze, just to try it out and stuff like that. So get in there, and again, same thing. I don't want to spread it out too much. I just want to sort of short, quick strokes to kind of get some stuff on there, and then you can kind of spread out what you put on there. And try to keep the brush strokes going one way on the first coat, and I'm going to switch on the second coat. So I'm going to go all the way for this first coat. Basically is going to go all the way around. And if I just did one color on this, it would be interesting to see what that color does when it's over on this texture. It's one of the reasons for putting texture sometimes is to kind of get something different on there. And the glazes potentially will, sort of change and break and move and thin out and do a little bit of something different on the textured part, and so you get some variation that can look really good, stuff like that. And it's nice to be able to later sort of experiment with glazes and see what they do on top of each other, and so it's nice to be able to write that down so you know what you did, what was on top, what was on the bottom, what were the first coats, and the successive coats and stuff, and how many coats, because some glazes maybe need a little bit more than others, and generally speaking they shouldn't. It should all be the same if they're mixed up like this. So I'm going to come and do this outside part now. I'm just going to sort of brush right up to that pencil line. You should always take your time with glazing. Have a plan, know what you're planning to do, and take your time, because it's kind of like if you're getting your kitchen remodeled, People can come in there and do really nice work, really nice plaster work, on the walls, and it gets really good, but a sloppy paint job will ruin the kitchen, ruin the piece, just like here. Bad glaze job will ruin the piece. If you don't get enough glaze on there and stuff like that, or too much and it runs and stuff like that, it can ruin the piece. And And that being said too, a good glaze job can make something that maybe wasn't so great, a little sloppy, some work, you know, you might have done, look really good. So it could really save a piece too. So, and so you can see how quickly, look how gray that is and stuff, and dries up so quickly, right? So I'll put that aside. I'm going to find my pen and make a little mark. I should probably write that this is the satin black. Make a little mark there that I did one coat, and this one here is my indigo float. And then this is probably dry enough to do the other coat. Now the first coat I did as I was going on the sides, I was coming up sort of vertically. And on the bottom I came sort of the long way. So when I do this next coat, I want to vary that. I want to change. So on the bottom I'm going to go across it like this short way, and then I'm going to, on the inside here, I'm going to sort of go long here and across this here. And the reason is that if you think of my fingers as sort of the brush strokes that when it kind of show up, and so they're all going this way, and so my second coat I kind of want to go like this, and so that they build up those coats and cross, and so when it melts it hopefully it kind of evens all out and have a nice even coat and we don't have any brush strokes showing up. And most of these glazes probably wouldn't do that anyway, but just to be sure I'm going to do that. So on the bottom here I'm going to go across, right, kind of get some glaze in there, and then come across, and then here on the top I'm going to come kind of, you know, horizontally, I suppose you could say. Kind of flip it around. See that? Then let that dry. Make my other mark, put a second coat on there, and that'll dry. And then already I can come right back to this guy. He's pretty much ready, you know, close. And the thing is to remember too that this is firing these glazes a chemical process, because this is a blue, right? And you're looking at this and you're thinking that's not blue, but remember that what it turns out like and what it looks like in its wet form are not necessarily going to be the same. And a lot of times they won't be the same. This is sort of a chemical process that as this fires and stuff and those chemicals mix and melt and sort of go off in the firing, it will go blue. And you have to just trust that that is the case. And stuff like that. You know, so we'll get another coat on there and dry. And then, you know, the other thing that I'll use this stoneware, this glaze called Tiger's Eye later, but just to kind of show you. So this is sort of a brownish that has a lot of variation, but in its wet form it's very red. And when it's real brick red like this, that usually means it has a bunch of iron oxide in it, red iron oxide, right? Which is kind of like just basically rust. That will stain your clothes. That won't stain your clothes. The black might stain your clothes. A lot of these light colors will not stain your clothes. This will stain your clothes, but they won't stain your clothes forever. If that was true, I would have specks of little red rusty dots all over everything I own. Washes out after a few times, but it will sort of stain. So those are the things to kind of be wary of. The other thing too is on all the glazes that we use too here in the classroom, they're all non-toxic, right? They all have the thing. Sometimes on some of these things they'll have this symbol here, which is the fork and knife, meaning that it's food safe, but all these are non-toxic, sort of food safe glazes that once they fired, they can be, you can eat off them, you can microwave them because they're stoneware, you can throw them in the dishwasher, all that stuff. They're, we're basically going to turn them into stone with a nice coat of basically colored glass on them with the glaze. So there's nothing that you're going to use in this classroom that is, has those, you have to worry about those kind of things. So then the other thing is we have this, our rattle too. So we fry tray, one of our plates and rattle, and how I might glaze this, this piece is, and this doesn't, I'm not so looking for like a super smooth surface necessarily on this because it is, look, a little sculpture, I'm not going to be eating off it. Something like this that I might eat off of or eat out of, I really want to have a nice smooth surface, easier to clean, feels better when you're sort of working with it. So this one I might really want to experiment with and see kind of what happens. So might use some of this gunmetal green on it, and then some of this sort of texturizer, which is sort of the stuff that basically you can put on top of a glaze or in between layers, and it's supposed to have some kind of effect and make stuff crawl and move and do some stuff. So so I'm just going to experiment with that, and so this is a good thing to be experimenting on because I'm not so worried about it being rough or sort of doesn't feel if it doesn't work as well. But these things I might be more worried. I'm going to use some of this experiment on this plate because it's kind of one of the things I like to do about those plates. So I'm going to get some coats on here and then we'll come back and talk a little bit more about finishing. Okay, so now that I've got most of my coats on and everything, I just need to kind of finish. So this one I had 2 coats of the gunmetal green, and then I put a coat of this texturizer to see what it might do, the gunmetal green, and then I'll put one more coat on this top of this texturizer. I like to kind of, on these ones, I want to kind of go up against little inside walls here. Now, important thing about these rattles is you don't want to get any glaze really inside your rattle because it'll fuse to the beads that are in there and then they won't rattle, right? So something to kind of think about. I just put so many holes on this one that potentially I did drip some glaze in there. So maybe not all my beads will rattle when this is all said and done, but we'll see what happens when it comes out of the firing, if it still has this sound to it. So get that last coat on, kind of pop it around, and this glaze is a little bit thinner than some of the other stuff too, so I just need to make sure I get a decent coat here. Kind of see what this texturizer does between these coats of gunmetal. And gunmetal green already has kind of a varied look, and it's not like it's a solid blue color. It does some interesting things, moves a little bit, and so texturizer could be really cool, or potentially could be really ugly. And so then I would know not to do that again, especially if you write it down somewhere what you did so you know. So if a combo comes out and you don't like the way it looks, you have it written down and then you know not to do that again. Most people, potters and the like, really tend to sort of use only a few glazes. So someone could build up their career as a potter using one type of clay and maybe 3 glazes. And they use the glazes that, one, work well together, work well with the clay body, have a good fit, as they say, with the clay body, and you know, look good aesthetically, right? And of course, sell. So those are sort of the things that a professional potter might do. So but they're not really working. It's not like they're going to keep 45 different glazes in their studio. But here in this sort of classroom situation, we want to have as many different choices for different types of aesthetics that people like. Some people like real bright colors. Other people really want to see, real earthy colors. People like stuff dark. All these different things. So I'll come back and clean some of that up in just a bit. What we'll do now is get this places I missed a little bit. Put that down. I can put this away now. Shouldn't really need it again. Keep my lid nice and closed and tight. Put that away. Now I also did this, and so what I did is I wrote everything down that I did or I'm going to do. So on this square one, here I have 4 coats of the black satin. On the edges here I have 2 coats of the black satin. On the back side I just have 2 coats. So, 3 coats. 3 coats here. And then here I just have 2 coats, and I have 1 coat of that texturizer on there, and then I'm going to put 1 last coat of Tiger's Eye. So I wrote down what the brand and name of the thing, but then also I put here, and I put when, so I put that this is the black underneath here is the 1st and 2nd coat, texturizer is the 3rd coat, and this Tiger's Eye is going to be the last coat. So I have it written down so I can look at it. These sheets are set up that if we want to do a prediction of what we think it looks like, and then actually the results, like sort of a scientific sort of discovery here. In the situation we're in this year, we don't need to do that necessarily. We just glaze our stuff, but it's always good to write it down because so you know what works, what doesn't work. So this glaze is not too thin, not super thick, but pretty much can put a nice little coat on here. And again, remember that glazes in their wet form do not necessarily, and most of the time do not really fire the same as they look when they here. So this is going to be a lot more of a sort of brownish color, this red normally. Now, on top of the texturizer, on top of that black, who knows? But there's one way to find out is to do a little experimentation. Write it down, fire it, and come out. And things aren't always super inconsistent, right? It depends on the kind of clay you're using, and it also depends on how you fire it. And the firings can be varied too, because we're using a gas kiln that we're sort of just turning up as we go along through the day. Every load is a little bit different, might be a little more packed, a little bit less packed. The atmosphere, kind of air that's coming in, the bottom that are feeding, that's the oxygen, kind of the atmosphere that's feeding the flames can be different. How fast it fires can be different, and so you get some different results. So that thing is done. Once it's dry, I'll take it outside to get it ready to load. Once I can handle it without screwing up the glaze. I want to touch the glaze the least amount possible. It's also really important to, if you're switching brushes, to really clean them really well. If you leave a little residue in there, on something like this, and then you're using a white glaze, you can really contaminate your glaze, and you won't get the results you're looking for. So it's important to sort of take care of this stuff. Now on this one here, I was using this June bug, which is sort of a green, like it's supposed to be an iridescent green, and we'll see if it works in my kale or not. Might not, and then we'll never use it again. But if it looks good, then we'll keep it. Could be different than this, but still look very good. So this is going to be sort of a green. Now this glaze seemed kind of thick, so I only put 3 coats. Same thing with this other blue hydrangea that I have over here, so I put 3 coats. So I wrote that down because it's a little thick, so I only put 3 coats on there. And I tend to, whatever they say on the directions on these things, if they say do 3 coats, I tend to put 4. Find that it turns out better. They're testing their stuff in really perfect conditions inside a lab at the company where they're using a really smooth white stoneware, and they're putting an electrical that's computer controlled, and the heat's all controlled. It ramps up, it ramps down slowly, kind of perfect sort of thing. So you have to test stuff and see what it turns out in the place that you fire. Right. So those plates are done. This is already dried. What I want to do now is, before I would think about doing another glaze, is I want to, on this surface, just kind of clean this stuff up and then let that dry before I put another glaze maybe on top of that. Right, so make sure that kind of goes along these edges there. So, you know, cleans off really easily with just a damp sponge. Just same thing, if you make a mistake and you get some glaze on the bottom where it shouldn't be, just take a damp sponge and clean it real easy. So I'll go through and clean all these edges and stuff and make sure that I don't have glaze up on this flat surface, because I want to do something different there, you know. And usually you like to kind of figure out something. If this is going to be sort of a swirly green, maybe a little bit on the lighter side, maybe it'll get darker with the texturizer on it, I might want to do something that contrasts heavily there, you know. Or, you know, some color that looks good next to green, you know. Could be a yellow, could be a light blue or something like that. Now this one, my little fry tray here, got all my coats on there, just did 4 coats of indigo float, which is going to be this sort of blue, almost a blue jean. It might be a little bit darker than that, the way our fire tends to turn out. But I know from experience, but also in general, that, you know, an orange looks pretty good next to these blues, you know. So I'm going to just highlight some of this edge, maybe put a little bit thin coat on the outside just to make it look a little bit different. Just pour a little bit of this orangey, as it's called. It seems a little bit thin, which is good, because I just want to put a little bit on just to make something look different. And I'm going to maybe stay short a little bit of the bottom here, so in case this makes it like a little bit too much and it runs, it won't really go that far. So I'm going to go come back like that. Now here's the thing too. If I screw up and all of a sudden I realize that's not what I planned to do, or that's not what I wanted to do, and oh shoot, what was I thinking? I was going to do something different in my head, and then start going and change my plans. And all of a sudden you realize that, and you just go, oh, poop sandwich. That's not what I want to do. You can just wash this whole thing off. Just take it right out of the sink, right under the water, scrub it down, wash it all off. A little bit of residue won't be a big deal usually. And then let it dry for a day, and then start over. No big deal. You can just kind of take care of stuff like that. So I think now I'll just try to kind of pepper this edge right there. The other thing too is about these edges like this, if it's on a bowl or a cup, you want to have a thicker glaze there if you can, because that's potentially where you're going to put your lips on something. So, like if you, you know, you want to have a really nice sort of flowing glaze on the edges like that. So especially if you had a bowl or something like that and you want to have a nice rounded edge, because you know, if you're eating Fruit Loops out of it, you get to the end and you have this nice sort of swirly sweet, you know, milk left over with all that sort of corn syrup left from the Fruit Loops and some food coloring swirling around, this sort of psychedelic mess there at the bottom of your bowl, but you want to drink all that up, that last little bit. You want to have a nice sort of, you know, edge that you put your lips to. Same thing with a cup, you know, any kind of cup like this and stuff. Nice rounded edge, you know. So it's not a bad idea to, you know, sort of sometimes double dip or put a little extra glaze on a lip of something, you know. So we'll see how this turns out. It's also pretty important, you know, make sure we don't waste glazes. Always want to make sure we can put everything back in we can. I use the brush to sort of really scoop every last bit I can get in there. So you just, as old Ben Franklin used to like to say, his Poor Richard's Almanac is waste not, want not. And sometimes it seems like it's just a little bit, but that little bit times 130 students over 9 months of a school year really adds up. Same thing with like recycling clay. A little bit here and there, but over time it can really add up. And then really make sure I'm going to clean these brushes really, really well and let them dry. And then I can come back and take a nice damp sponge and clean up my area, or maybe I might even just always lay out newspaper, an old newspaper or something like that to work on, and then I can just crumple that up when I'm done. So be real methodical when we glaze. Plan your stuff out, write things down that you do so you know when you get it back later what you did, and if it was good, you know how to do it again. If it was horrible, you know how not to do it again. So that's the basics of glazing for now. We can add stuff to it later as we move along.
There's material, there's a gesture towards the object, a movement on the object, a motion with the material. There's a pause, a rotating gaze, years of observing black holes into a minute. The final product, idiosyncratic, does not make you a materialist. If I give it to you, or you buy it from me, it does not make you a materialist.